In terms of the speaking order, we will begin with the chair and ranking member, then members present at the time the hearing is called to order. Will be recognized in order of seniority, and finally, members not present at the time the hearing is called to order will be recognized. Finally, House rules require me to remind you that we have set up an email address to which members can send anything they wish to submit in writing at any of our hearings or markups. That email address has been provided in advance to your staff. The subcommittee will come to order. Good morning. We meet today to review the President's fiscal year 2022 budget request for the Department of Justice. I am pleased to welcome our new Attorney General, Merrick Garland, for his first appearance before this subcommittee. Our Attorney General has a distinguished career in public service with an enviable academic record and an impressive trajectory in private practice. He chose to take up the mantle of federal prosecutor. In the course of that work, he led the investigation and prosecution of the Oklahoma City bombing case and supervised major cases such as the Unabomber case before joining the second highest court in our nation, the United States Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia. He served there with great distinction for 24 years, 7 as chief judge, where his reputation as an influential and formidable jurist was widely acknowledged. The Department of Justice mission encompasses the whole range of public and civic life, protecting the fundamental freedoms to vote, express ourselves, worship, study, and work without fear. Above all, the Department of Justice ensures the rule of law is followed under our Constitution. As a result, the Attorney General, through the department, exercises many broad functions, including leading the domestic federal response to terrorism and foreign threats, employing expansive criminal and civil investigative, enforcement, and regulatory responsibilities, serving as a watchdog for civil and human rights, playing a key role in our immigration system, determining benefits and citizenship, leading national efforts against trafficking in human beings, illicit drugs and firearms, operating detention and correction programs responsible for hundreds of thousands of people who are awaiting trial or serving federal sentences, and through its grants and related service programs, improving access to and administration of justice at state, local, and tribal levels. To carry out the department's many missions, the so-called skinny budget that the Office of Management and Budget provided Congress on April 9 proposes a funding level of $35.2 billion in fiscal year 2022, a $1.8 billion or 5.3% increase over the fiscal year 2021 enacted level. And of course, the department continues to operate during this global health pandemic, albeit one that should be lessening under your watch, General Garland. While we are somewhat limited because we have yet to receive the full budget proposal, today we will discuss and review the initiatives highlighted in the skinny budget that was forwarded. The proposed increase for civil rights enforcement is sorely needed. This is an historic opportunity to address systemic barriers to full participation in society, ensure access to economic opportunities, and protect the right to vote. As we face unprecedented threats from domestic violent extremism, such as the attack on the Capitol on January 6th this year, and a national epidemic of firearm deaths and injuries, your proposed increases to address those problems are critical, and we look forward to your testimony and your explanation of how these funds will be utilized. We also want to hear how the department would use proposed increases to the Office of Violence Against Women to support victims and aid in our fight against heinous gender-based crimes. The administration has proposed a $157 million increase for the Executive Office for Immigration Review to reduce delays in immigration processing. We expect to learn more about how the department can help make our immigration system work fairly and efficiently. We also are interested in your plans in other priority areas, including environmental justice and protecting intellectual property rights to ensure the U.S. can compete fairly on the global stage, as well as protects American industries and jobs. The department is, like our country, at a crossroads. As a nation, we must work to restore faith, not only in our political system, but in the ties that bind us together as a society. These ties have been tested, certainly, but not broken, and we must ensure that remains true. Attorney General Garland, you are entrusted to restore faith in the department and its ability to carry out impartially on a nonpartisan basis its historic responsibilities. I know these are challenges you will face head on. We look forward to working with you on all of these challenges. And Attorney General Garland, we look forward to your testimony. And at this time, I'd like to turn to our esteemed ranking member, Mr. Adeholt, and yield to him for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It is good to be with you this morning, and thank you for yielding. I, too, would like to welcome Attorney General Garland to the Commerce, Justice, and Science Subcommittee of Appropriations to testify regarding the Department of Justice 2022 budget request. First of all, congratulations to you, Attorney General Garland, on your new role, and your stewardship there at the Department of Justice is important to all of our communities around this nation, and we sincerely do wish you well. While we still don't have your full budget to review, as the chairman mentioned, I have taken note of the administration's budget summary for the Department of Justice and the programmatic increases highlighted therein. These substantial increases, such as the doubling of the budget for the Office of Violence Against Women, hundreds of millions of dollars for new sensitivity training programs and other efforts to improve police-community relationships, and the $100 million to incentivize states to enact new gun control laws, just to name a few, add up very quickly and likely come at expense of some of the more important national priorities. And yet it's important to know or evaluate any trade-offs that are being made, because your budget summary only tells one side of the story. However, we can glean what we've been provided that from among the lower priorities are resources to address foreign terrorist threats, improve human trafficking prosecutions, and protect U.S. intelligence property against foreign government interference and exploitation. I do believe that there will be opportunities to find some agreement on measures to reduce violent crime, fight the scourge of addiction, and protect the vulnerable from those who would seek to abuse or exploit them. But I'm concerned that if implemented, this budget would irresponsibly invest taxpayer dollars in initiatives that lack the proper grounding in evidence or in science, such as the highly questionable gun buyback schemes and controversial restorative justice programs. Serious initiatives are needed to address the violent crime plaguing many U.S. cities. If the Department of Justice truly wants to address gun crime, it must not waste its precious resources on these liberal feel-good programs like gun buybacks and incentives for licensing restrictions that infringe upon the Second Amendment rights of law-abiding citizens, while there's those that are on the streets that ignore those with impunity, the same way they ignore every other gun law that's on the books today. It is my opinion that if you truly want to make a difference, piling on new laws and burdensome reporting requirements will not be the solution. America needs tough, nonsense enforcements to remove not just the guns, but the shooters from the streets once and for all. Sustain systemic and coordinated law enforcement initiatives like Operation Legend, which surge resources and federal law enforcement assistance into major cities last year to fight crime alongside state and local officers are a good start. Further, the budget summary is signaling some troubling policy shifts. I will have some questions as we move forward in this hearing today about whether these policy priorities comport with the bipartisan bicameral agreement that funded the Department of Justice for the current fiscal year, as new initiatives and undertakings necessarily require resources to implement. Investigating and prosecuting alleged civil rights violations by police officers is a legitimate focus for the Department of Justice. I nevertheless have concerns about the decision to revive the Obama administration's heavy-handed, constitutionally troubling, and questionably effective approach to consent decrees. I'm also interested in hearing your perspective on the humanitarian and the security crisis on our southern border and how it affects the workload of the Department of Justice. Also, I'd like to hear how the Justice Department is working to prevent the proceeds of human smuggling operations from further fueling violent cartels, creating even more dangerous conditions in Mexico and the Northern Triangle countries. I strongly believe that supporting law enforcement and immigration policies that serve to mitigate the crisis on our southern border should be a top priority for this subcommittee. Attorney General Garland, we recognize that you have an incredibly demanding job. No one would minimize that. And I hope your testimony today will reveal well-reasoned approach to the many difficult criminal justice issues that affect our local communities in reflection to your years of service to our community and certainly also as a federal judge. We want to work with you to ensure that the programs you administer are as effective and efficient as possible in supporting the rule of law. And I look forward to working with Chairman Cartwright in support of funding of the many important missions of the Department of Justice as this year's appropriations process moves forward. Again, we do appreciate you being here today virtually to answer our questions, and we look forward to receiving the department's complete budget submission while there's still time to give it our full attention. So again, thank you for your testimony today, and Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Adderholt. And Attorney General Garland, you are recognized for your 5 minutes of testimony. Please don't worry about leaving something out. Your entire written submission will be included for the record, and try to hit the highlights in 5 minutes. You are recognized, Attorney General Garland.
Good morning, Chairman Cartwright, Ranking Member Adderholt, and other distinguished members. I'm honored to make my first appearance before the subcommittee. I'm here today to discuss the President's Department of Justice budget request for fiscal year 2022. Let me start by thanking you for your support for the department in the recently enacted FY 2021 Omnibus Appropriations Act. In remarks to the 115,000 plus employees of the Justice Department on my first day in office, I explained how I will approach this job. Quote, all of us are united by our commitment to the rule of law and to seeking equal justice under law. We are united by our commitment to protecting our country, as our oath says, from all enemies, foreign and domestic, and by our commitment to enforcing our country's laws and to ensuring the civil rights and civil liberties of our people. My approach reflects the Justice Department's mission, and the department's mission is reflected in our $35.2 billion FY 2022 budget request. I'll share a few highlights with you now. First, our budget supports my commitment to protecting our national security, including addressing both international and domestic terrorism, while respecting civil liberties. It includes increases of $45 million for the FBI domestic terrorism investigations and $40 million for the U.S. attorneys to manage increasing domestic terrorism caseloads. Second, almost 65 years after its creation, the Civil Rights Division's work remains vital to addressing unlawful discrimination and bias. Our budget seeks to increase the department's civil rights funding by $33 million, providing a total of $209 million for the Civil Rights Division, the Community Relations Service, and related civil rights work. From protecting voting rights to prosecuting hate crimes like those experienced by our Asian American and Pacific Islander communities during the pandemic, DOJ's civil rights work is critical to protecting the American dream. Another highlight of the President's request is an historic investment of $1 billion to support the work of the Justice Department's Office of Violence Against Women. The important grant programs administered by OVW will assist our state, local, territorial, and tribal partners in addressing gender-based violence. In addition, $120 million is provided to expand our efforts to address widespread rape kit backlogs and to fund new investigative training programs for law enforcement officers and prosecutors in units dedicated to investigating gender-based violence. Promoting public trust between communities and law enforcement is essential to making both communities and policing safer. Our budget proposes increased investment in programs that support community-oriented policing and addressing systemic inequities, including $1.2 billion, an increase of $304 million. Gun deaths continue to occur at a staggering rate in our country. There is more that we can do to make our communities safer. This is both a law enforcement and a public health issue. We are seeking to increase our support to combat gun violence by $232 million for FY 2022, supporting both DOJ federal law enforcement resources as well as grant funding for community violence intervention programs, improved background checks, and more comprehensive red flag laws. We are also stepping up our work on environmental justice. Communities of color, low-income communities, and tribal communities often suffer the most harm from environmental crimes and pollution. Among our efforts, we are seeking increased resources for our Environment and Natural Resource Division to help these vulnerable populations. The antitrust laws are the charter of our economic liberty, and the Justice Department is committed to enforcing them. The FY 22 request for increased resources for the Antitrust Division reflects that commitment. Finally, there are nearly 1.3 million cases pending before the immigration courts. A 21% budget increase for the Executive Office for Immigration Review will help support 100 new immigration judges, improve technology, and other efficiency mechanisms to reduce that backlog. I have mentioned only a few of the department's important programs this morning. I ask your support for our budget as the entire department works to ensure adherence to the rule of law, protection of public safety, and equal justice for all Americans. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Attorney General Garland. At this time, we'll start the questioning period. I'll open by recognizing myself for 5 minutes of questioning. I want to start with civil rights and in particular, voting rights. I'm 60 years old, Attorney General Garland, and for almost my entire life, what was normal in the United States was that if a jurisdiction wanted to change its voting laws, it had to get pre-clearance from the Justice Department or the District Court in the District of Columbia. That was because of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Now, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 came about largely because of the efforts of our dear departed colleague, John Lewis, and his efforts that culminated in Bloody Sunday in Selma, Alabama in the spring of 1965. And it led to the passage of that bill and into law in August. That was sustained by the United States Supreme Court in South Carolina versus Katzenbach the next year. And it has been called one of the most effective pieces of civil rights legislation in American history. In fact, that was called that by the Justice Department in 2014. All of that was upended in 2013 by the Shelby County decision, which all of a sudden invalidated the pre-clearance requirement. So now, instead of normal, what we have is the Justice Department has to file suit every time there's an unconstitutional change in voting laws that offends the 15th Amendment or some other part of the Constitution. And as a result, your Justice Department has to spend a lot more money filing lawsuits to reverse these voting law changes. Am I correct in that? You're muted, sir.
I'm sorry, we'll try to get the technology better. This is my first virtual hearing. Yes, you are correct. Shelby County invalidated the coverage formula, which permitted the pre-clearance program to continue. So it is now the case that the Justice Department is largely limited to bringing affirmative cases in which it finds under Section 2 of the Act unconstitutional practices or procedures with respect to voting that discriminate against race. This does require us to bring individual cases. That is a much more time-consuming and more expensive process.
In fact, what it does is it reverses the burden of proof. It was normal during the vast bulk of my lifetime that if a jurisdiction wanted to change their voting laws, it was a jurisdiction that was listed as among those having traditionally and historically violated the Constitution for voting rights. The jurisdiction like that wanted to change its voting laws, you know, to make people guess how many jelly beans are in the jar, or to enact sweeping purges of voting rolls, things like that. They had to get pre-clearance. They had to get permission from the Attorney General. And so the Attorney General was in control of that. Now it's all flipped on its head. The Attorney General has to file a lawsuit and carry the burden of proof, which could involve months and months and even years of litigation to invalidate, you know, a Jim Crow kind of a voting law change like that. Am I correct, Attorney General? You're muted again, sir.
Am I mute now?
I can hear you.
Okay, thank you. I'm sorry, I'm just get back to the question. You are correct that the burden of proof is now on the Justice Department to prove in each individual case a violation of the Voting Rights Act.
Well, what we're here to talk about are resources for your Department of Justice. What does that mean? If we have any hope of preserving voting rights in the parts of this country that historically discriminated against African Americans and others on the basis of race for voting rights, if we have any hope of combating these changes, you know, that are being enacted vigorously now in the United States, how much money is it going to cost the American taxpayer because of that Shelby County decision?
The right to vote is absolutely fundamental. It is the cornerstone of our democracy. The Justice Department is pledged as part of its original purpose in its establishment during Reconstruction to protect voting rights. The 1965 Voting Rights Act gave us additional authorities, one part of which was removed as a consequence of the Shelby County case. We do now have to bring each case individually, and you are correct, that is a very large investment of resources, and that's part of the reason why we're asking for the 15.8% increase in the budget for the Civil Rights Division.
Well, I thank you for that, and I yield now to our distinguished ranking member, Mr. Adderholt, for 5 minutes of questions.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Attorney General, my first question would involve the immigration courts. Advocates have claimed that 89% of all asylum applicants attended their final court hearing to receive a decision on their application. However, this claim is misleading because the DOJ's own stats demonstrate that 38% of individuals whose cases began with a credible fear never even bothered to file an asylum application, despite claiming a fear of returning to their home country. Hence, they are not even being counted among the pool of asylum applicants. Based on this information, do you agree that the stats like the doubtful 89% statistic I mentioned don't tell the whole story of the immigration enforcement crisis that's currently going on in this country?
Congressman, I'm not familiar with these specific statistics, nor the rebuttal to the specifics that you presented. But I will certainly ask my team and the people who don't know those statistics to get back to your staff on that.
Okay, that would be helpful if you could do that. And could you tell us what specific measures that you have implemented, or maybe that you plan to implement, to enforce the immigration laws and protect the current rule of law?
Yeah, so there for the Department of Justice, there are a number of issues. I'll make clear, of course, that the Border Patrol and the Customs and ICE are all in the Department of Homeland Security, and so they have the primary responsibility at the border. We have a large number of U.S. attorneys at the border who prosecute the cases that are brought to them by the Department of Homeland Security agents, and so part of our budget request is for money for them. Then we do manage the immigration courts, the immigration judges. That's our Executive Office of Immigration Review. That's the principal amount of the increase in money that we're asking for in this area, an increase of 21%. That's because we had, at the time the new administration took office, over 1 million cases backlogged in that system. We're going to need new additional immigration judges. So part of this increase is to add 100 immigration judges plus the teams of support and technology that are necessary to accelerate the hearings in those cases.
Okay. Oh, as is noted, the immigration court's backlog stands over 1.3 million cases. I think that you have noted that. In 25 hearing locations, understand that an individual will wait over 3 years for adjudication, and in 3 locations, they'll wait over 4 years. The previous administration implemented a case-based performance metrics as a basis for evaluating immigration court judicial resources. Are those performance metrics still being utilized under your administration?
So can you hear me?
Yes.
My understanding is that the Executive Office of Immigration Review is reviewing the nature of those metrics, trying to figure out ways of accelerating performance. Of course, any system requires some set of metrics. Precisely which metrics are reviewed on a regular routine basis. And we're going to be doing that to ensure that we both provide due process for the people coming through the system, but also efficiency for the system itself.
What effects is the pending caseload having on due process? And do you have any concern about that issue at all?
I'm very concerned about the backlog. I think it obviously is not working for the people who are in the system and not working for the government with respect to evaluating those people. We have cut IJ hiring times, IJ immigration judges, from 2+ years now to approximately 6 months. So we expect to be able to get a lot more immigration judges in than so far we had been able to hire, and then we're asking for an additional 100 as well. That should, of course, cut the backlog.
Okay, but due process is something you were concerned about in this regard.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, of course. The longer people are waiting, and the bigger the workload, and the faster judges have to decide. the less due process is provided. So we're concerned to get the right balance.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Adderholt. At this time, the chair recognizes Representative Grace Meng for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Congratulations again, Mr. Attorney General Garland. I wanted to applaud your March 30th memorandum, which directs a 30-day review and commitment to a whole of agency approach to addressing hate-based violence and incidents against the Asian Pacific American community. I appreciate so much your leadership and shows the community that their concerns are our government's concerns. As you know, May is Asian Pacific American Heritage Month, and I believe this month's celebration should be a clarion call for the community and our nation to shout that anti-Asian hate is unequivocally wrong. Can you share with this subcommittee what the findings and recommendations are? And what additional resources do you need to ensure the change you envision will succeed? And part two of this question is, while your memo discusses the need for better resources to combat hate crimes, you also state correctly that communities will need additional tools to heal after hateful incidents occur. There's a great role for DOJ's Community Relations Service to play in healing those affected by hate crimes and violence, including those who are the ones who commit the acts. Some communities are distrustful of law enforcement and attorneys' offices, but may be more receptive to someone from CRS for solutions that bring restorative justice and peace to their community. So I wanted to ask, from your perspective, is CRS scalable, and how can we work, if increasing funds, that to work to ensure that CRS will engage with communities on the ground? And separately, how can DOJ help local community groups seek help outside of the criminal justice system, developing alternatives to carceral punishment for those convicted of hate crimes?
Well, you hit on a question that's I only recently realized was extremely important, not the hate crimes issue, but the community relations service one. So I'm very familiar with the service, it having been quite important the last time I was at the Justice Department and doing the kind of work you're talking about, in developing better relationships between communities, victims, and police. So one of the first things I did when we were all concerned about what might be happening in Minneapolis was to call and ask that members of the Community Relations Service to assess how many there were there and how many more could be brought. Sadly, I learned we only had about 26 or 27 total members of the Community Relations Service at this point. That service has, I would say, badly withered over the years. Over quite a number of years. And so an important part of our request for a budget increase for the Civil Rights Division is to increase hiring for the Community Relations Service. So I think it's a very good point you raised, and I'm not sure that many people understand what good work the Community Relations Service can do. With respect to the hate crimes issue, a significant part also of the money increase for Civil Rights Division will go to hate crime prosecutions. The division does prosecute those, and with the additional money, we'll be able to look into that further. You're also right that prosecution isn't the only solution here, and so we have grant programs under the Office of Justice Programs that we're hoping to move in that direction. You asked for non-incarceral resolutions, and so part of that is what's called restorative justice, a chance for victims and victimizers to work, get together in a certain way to both reduce recidivism and to reduce the pain felt by the victim. So there are a number of, it's a pretty broad set of programs that we have available in this area.
Thank you so much. I really look forward to working with you on this issue.
Thank you.
I yield back.
Thank you, Representative Meng. At this time, the chair recognizes Mr. Palazzo for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Attorney General Garland, thank you for being here today. I would like to briefly address the crisis that we have at our southern border. It seems to be somewhat of a manufactured crisis, but it is a crisis. It is a huge challenge. We basically have an invasion taking place in our southern border. And listen, I know we got to handle this in a humanitarian way, and I'm all for that, but we're also a nation of law and order. And without law and order, we're creating chaos. My biggest concern is the flow of people, not those who are coming through the points of entry, but it's the ones that are taking advantage of this crisis. And it's the human trafficking, it's the drug smuggling, it's the bringing in of foreign nationals, some who have been apprehended that we know are on the terror watch list. So can you address what is the Department of Justice seeing at the border? Are there foreign actors coming across that could be dangerous? I mean, what are we doing? I mean, because we all respect, the FBI and our law enforcement communities and officers, and I just feel like that we're just adding a huge burden upon them, but more so upon our local law enforcement officers who are going to have to be basically dealing with the criminal activity that's coming across and the hard narcotics in their backyards. Can you quickly address what the Department of Justice is doing, and how are you advising the administration to get this under control?
Look, the issue of major narcotics traffickers sending narcotics across the border is a vital concern to us. Particularly now the transition to the synthetic opioids, to the fentanyl analogs. The precursors of these are coming in some part from China, moving into Mexico, then moving across the border. We have put a lot of effort into interdiction and into enforcement on this. We're spending $2.2 billion in the current FY21 budget across DOJ for immigration Southwest border enforcement. This funds our DEA agents, and as I mentioned in the previous question, our prosecutors in the Southwest border. One of the first things I did internationally as Attorney General was to speak to the Attorney General of Mexico to seek and confirm his cooperation with respect to fighting transnational narcotics organizations, and he pledged his support to this as well. So this is a serious problem, and we are seized with it.
Well, one thing's for sure, the transnational criminal organizations are making a fortune off the crisis at the border, and the flow of drugs. And if you just look at what the Coast Guard's pulling off the oceans before it makes its way into America, and we're talking about hundreds of millions of tons of cocaine over the past several years, and it's going to be a huge crisis. I mean, we already have so many issues facing our country. Real quick, can you address what are we doing to counter China, especially in their theft of international or intellectual property? We know they love to steal our technology, and it's actually allowed them to close the technological gap to actually exceed us in some areas, which is a national security crisis as well. But it's also just a theft of trillions of dollars of our resources paid for either private or public institutions here in America. Obviously, it's unfair. They don't see it that way. They see it as all being, fair game to steal other countries, intellectual property. What's the DOJ doing to counter that? And are y'all prosecuting individuals engaged in theft of our international property?
Well, within the last month or so, the intelligence community has identified China as a threat in precisely the regard that you mentioned with respect to espionage, with respect to theft of intellectual property. So, the FBI is working very hard on these issues. There's also obviously an important cybercrime and a cyber hacking element of this. And so a lot of money and new resources are being put into protecting against that hacking and then prosecuting where we're unsuccessful in protection and then plugging the holes.
Well, thank you, sir. I appreciate your time and yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Palazzo. At this time, the chair recognizes Mr. Case of Hawaii for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Attorney General Garland. First of all, I want to, as a representative from Hawaii with the highest percentage of Asia Pacific Americans in the entire country, I want to fully associate myself with my colleague Ms. Meng's remarks as to hate crimes, as well as to endorse your efforts to take a whole of government approach. That's critical for us to get to the bottom of this and do whatever we can in that regard. So I appreciate your effort on that front. Second, as to Mr. Palazzo's comments about China, the Department of Justice does have the China initiative underway, which I believe is appropriate under the circumstances. I don't think any of us should be under any illusions as to what China is up to here. However, there have been many concerns across our country, especially in our Chinese American community, as to really profiling of Chinese Americans in connection with reviews of China's interference and theft of our intellectual property, et cetera, particularly in our institutions of higher learning. So I would simply relay a caution to you that please be very attentive to those concerns and take them seriously. The intelligence community has done that, and within your own organization, I hope you will as well. Let me cover an issue which is not specific to Hawaii, but impacts us in particular, and that is that in our federal district court system, our District of Hawaii has been without a residential reentry center for almost 2 years now. We had a residential reentry center, or halfway house, if you want to refer to it as that, for 29 years until 2019, when the situation changed, and we have been struggling with DOJ and the Bureau of Prisons in particular to get one up and running again. And of course, you know from your own experience that the consequence of the absence of a residential reentry center not only prevents a reintegration of federal inmates into their community, but in the case of the District of Hawaii, and I think this is true beyond the District of Hawaii, the courts utilize that as an alternative to incarceration for two distinct populations, pretrial release and those on supervised release, or so-called public law placement. When you dig down to the bottom of this issue, it seems to be a question of unrealistic expectations being placed on the solicitation process and the bid process. We are in a unique situation here in Hawaii, and essentially the solicitations are ruling out any effective bids on this, and that's just not acceptable. We cannot send our prisoners and former inmates to the continental United States for these purposes. We shouldn't have to do that. The discussion has been the alternative of day release, which is not going to do the trick. And so I would simply ask for your own personal review and attention to this issue to see whether we can't punch through this and get that solution in place as soon as possible. May I respectfully request that?
Yes, of course. Residential reentry is critical to the First Step Act and the Second Chance Act approaches, which were passed by Congress. They are the way both to reduce our prison population and also to prevent recidivism and to make it easier for people to reintegrate into the community and become good citizens within the community. So they are quite essential in that regard. I don't know the specifics with respect to the entry program in Hawaii, although I do understand that there's a new solicitation being worked on, and I will ask my members of the team to work this up, and then talk to your staff about it directly.
Thank you very much, Attorney General. My remaining time, let me just follow up on Mr. Palazzo's comments on immigration, and I won't have time for you to respond, but I leave this with you. In reviewing immigration and especially a recent trip to the border, it became crystal clear to me that the burden on our immigration judges is in fact very, very acute, and is essentially incentivizing, as Mr. Palazzo said, the cartels to manipulate weaknesses in our system to basically enhance human trafficking and their profits. And the critical weakness here is a lack of adjudication on a timely manner of immigration-related issues. And so my question to you, and we can take this up after the fact, is your request itself sufficient to handle what you view as correctly as a huge problem? Is that going to do the job in terms of re-incentivizing that? And I'm afraid I'm going to have to leave you with that hanging question and hopefully take it up with you in some other way. But it's a rhetorical question. Is that enough? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Case. And we'll allow the witness to answer. Take 30 seconds and tell us what you can in that space of time, Attorney General.
So, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Yeah. So we have asked for a substantial increase for immigration judges, and equally important for the whole team that supports immigration judges. This will be extremely helpful for us at this point, and this is the amount that we need right now.
Thank you.
At this time, the chair recognizes Congressman Ben Klein for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Chairman Cartwright. I appreciate you and Ranking Member Adderholt for holding today's hearing. Ensuring that our justice system is operating effectively and efficiently in accordance with the law is essential, and I appreciate the Attorney General, his appearance before us today to discuss the department's funding request. I'll go out of order in my questions briefly just to address the burden on immigration judges. I would posit that it is a direct result of this administration's changes in policies and put in place a catch and release program, repealing of remain across the border while their asylum claims are being heard, the numerous policy changes that have incentivized individuals to make this journey with small children and claim asylum when for no other reason other than they are trying to escape poverty. Now, that is a reason to explore legal immigration process and reforms, but I would argue that it is not cause for asylum. And I would argue that before we grant a significant increase in funding for immigration judges, we need to see some recognition by this administration that it is first indeed a crisis, and secondly, that they are taking steps to address this crisis by restoring some order to the border and some structure to enforcing our border. I want to ask the Attorney General, in the past, GAO has estimated that the department has not collected most of the outstanding criminal debt, both fines and restitution, due to, among other factors, the nature of the debt and a lack of coordination between relevant DOJ components. My last report was that it was under a 5% collection rate. That is abhorrent. At the end of fiscal year 2016, DOJ had identified $10 billion of outstanding collectible restitution debt. So as you come asking for an increase in budgeting, is collecting this debt a priority for the department at all? And is DOJ adequately measuring its criminal debt collection performance against any established goals?
Well, certainly bringing in the money that is owed is very important to the department. This problem of debt collection has been a problem for since the last time I was in the Justice Department, and I certainly will draw my attention to this again. Of course, the restitution issue doesn't go to the government. The restitution goes to the victims. But I will certainly look at this question. The more money we can bring in from people who owe us money, the less money we would need from you. Although again, I don't believe the debt goes directly to the Justice Department, but to the Treasury as is appropriate.
I appreciate that. Shifting over to another topic. Last year, we saw an unprecedented and overwhelming number of firearm sales, and with those sales, an unprecedented increase in checks run through the National Instant Criminal Background Check System. In fact, the one-year increase from 2019 to 2020 alone was nearly 40%. In your opinion, does NICS have the necessary resources to handle what I'd imagine is continued strain on the system? And can you provide the committee with the latest stats on the percentage of background checks that fall into, rather than proceed or denied status, delayed status, and the percentage of those checks that are then resolved within 3 business days, 10, 30, and 88 business days when they're purged from the system?
Well, Congressman, you're absolutely right that the more sales there are, the more pressure there is on NICS to do the background checks. Obviously, absolutely right. We have in FY21, we received $168 million for expanding NICS capacity and to address the workload increases for FBI and ATF. So we have resources that we're now being able to put into this problem. I don't know the statistics. I know the issue that you're talking about. I don't know the statistics on how long a delay there is and whether it's satisfied within the 3-day proceed window.
Well, if you could get those to us, I'd appreciate that.
Of course, and we will do that.
I'll just ask one more question. Current law requires a prospective buyer of a firearm to provide a photo ID to exercise this core constitutional right. Would you argue that that is a reasonable requirement?
I would, but I don't know what the requirements are. Again, this is slightly beyond my area of expertise, and I'd have to look into what the requirements are.
Well, 26A on the form requires a valid government photo ID. So,
well, there you have it. Then that's the answer.
And you would argue that that is a responsible requirement.
I would.
Would you also argue that to exercise your constitutional right to vote, that requiring a photo ID, government issued photo ID, would also be a reasonable requirement? I'm sorry, you're muted, sir.
I'm sorry. I think I may be being muted by the committee, subcommittee every time a member speaks, but we're doing the best we can here. So,
I appreciate that.
I'm sorry.
Would you consider that?
Yeah. So the question on voter ID is what kind of disparate impact it has on voters of different races, colors, and language groups, and whether it violates the Constitution by having a disparate impact on people's ability to vote. The Supreme Court has held that voter ID as a concept is constitutional. And the issue is what, in any individual case, does the records show about whether it deprives certain groups protected by the 14th Amendment right to vote. That's the question. It's not a question of whether voter ID is sensible or not sensible. It's a question of how it impacts and what the cost of that impact is, and what.
But you don't ask that question for a Second Amendment rights when then purchasing a firearm.
I think you
Mr.
would.
Klein, we're going to have a second round of questions.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
All right. At this time, the chair recognizes Congresswoman Brenda Lawrence for 5 minutes of questions.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much, and congratulations, Attorney General. I wanted to ask a question about mental health and law enforcement. The Biden administration's skinny budget includes an incentive to partner mental health providers with law enforcement across the country, which I believe is incredibly important as we look toward ensuring that community policing and meeting the needs of all of our residents. Will the department be taking any efforts to prioritize grant applicants who intend to use funds to expand or create partnerships between mental health providers and law enforcement?
I think the answer in general to that is yes. We do believe that taking the burden off of law enforcement, particularly with respect to some of these very high-risk contacts with people who have mental disabilities or who are in crisis for any other reason, and to bring along or to substitute social workers and mental health care professionals is a good way to reduce risk for the officer and for the person who's involved. So there's $271 million in our OJP increase request, the Office of Justice Programs, to reforming court processes. And this also includes separately the question of having mental health courts and drug courts, which is another related issue to the one you were asking about.
Thank you so much. I want to talk to you a little bit about the Civil Rights Division. For example, after years of arguing that a Texas voter ID law intentionally discriminated against minorities, the previous administration, Justice Department, abandoned that position. Today, states across the country, including my home state of Michigan, are attempting to pass restrictive measures that will clearly make it harder for Americans to vote. Additionally, even a number of hate crimes across the country spiked, and federal prosecutors of hate crimes have come close to keeping pace. Can you explain how the Civil Rights Division will once again return to its mission to uphold civil and constitutional rights for all Americans?
The Justice Department, as I mentioned, was founded with the principal original purpose of protecting the rights of African Americans during Reconstruction, their rights, particularly with respect to voting, but also with respect to protection against domestic violent extremists, and the first incarnation of the Ku Klux Klan. That was the original purpose of the department, reinvigorated when the Civil Rights Division was created by one of the Civil Rights Acts. We are carrying that forward now by requesting a 18.6% increase in our budget for civil rights enforcement over last year. A portion of that money will go into the voting rights issues about which you were just speaking. And a portion of that money will also go into protection against and enforcement of hate crimes statutes, which Congress has provided us.
Ms. Lawrence, you are muted, I think.
Two things are really important to me. The mental health piece. When we look at justice and policing, and we see so many people who are mentally ill, and we see police officers who are not equipped to respond to a person having a psychotic episode versus a criminal. In addition to that, if you truly believe in something, it will be funded, and it will be a department under your leadership that will actively uphold their responsibility when it comes to civil rights. So I look forward to your leadership. Thank you so much. And we have a lot of work to do in your department. Thank you so much, and I yield back.
Thank you, Congresswoman Lawrence. At this time, the chair recognizes Mr. Garcia for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Attorney General, thank you. Congratulations on the appointment, and thank you for your service to our beautiful nation and the monumental mission you have in front of you here. I'm from California, northern LA County. We are a state where we have a legal cannabis industry, but we're also a state, and especially in my district in the deserts above Los Angeles, where we're seeing a massive influx of an illegal marijuana industry And I think it's being understated at local levels, at state levels, and certainly not appreciated at the federal level. I've been able to take a tour with the local law enforcement agencies to see it from the air. And I can tell you firsthand that if you remember the first time you went flying over a small neighborhood, your reaction was probably, wow, I can't believe there's this many pools in our neighborhoods. I had the same reaction when I toured our Antelope Valley area with regards to these illegal pot operations. There are literally hundreds, if not thousands, of these greenhouses being propped up in our deserts, in areas where frankly vegetation should not be growing. It's difficult to farm out here. What's happening is we have folks who are operating illegally on a black market who are stealing natural resources. They're stealing water. In many cases, the folks working these illegal pot operations are indentured servants illegally here, trying to make ends meet and being taken advantage. We have folks being local citizens being intimidated by some of these transnational criminal organizations that are running these illegal marijuana operations. The magnitude of this problem is staggering. And I know that the federal government, I know that DOJ under DEA has pots of money that do go towards eradicating these illegal marijuana operations. But it is at a magnitude, like I said, that's beyond comprehension, I think, and I really do believe it's worth the DOJ's attention, not only at the federal level, but also in support of the local law enforcement agencies. My question is what, in your opinion, can be done from a federal level to help prosecute folks who are growing marijuana illegally? There's a series of charges that have been deemed really misdemeanors: the distribution, the sale, the growing of marijuana in California is treated as misdemeanors, but the stealing of natural resources, in some cases, the squatting on land, the intimidation against local residents for reporting.
This meeting is being recorded.
Is rising to the level of felony behavior, and frankly, it is a true security issue at the local level, but also national security. What can we do at the federal level under your administration and your leadership to help us eradicate the illegal marijuana problem?
Well, I'm not precisely familiar with the specifics, obviously, that you were able to see through your aerial flights. But the department's view on marijuana use is that enforcement against use is not a good use of our resources. I understand that's not what you're talking about. We're really talking about growing and manufacturing at a large scale. We it's probably not a good use of our resources where it is regulated by the state. And again, I take it that that's not what you're asking about. So to the extent you're asking, for example, about transnational operations of large amounts coming from Mexico, or of transnational operators who are coming into the United States to do the growing, these are certainly within our jurisdiction and within our scope of concern.
Well, thank you, Attorney General. I would love to host you out here to get you and your respective points of contact a first row view of what's going on out here. It is staggering. The local law enforcement agencies get about $19,000 per year from the federal government for overtime to help fight this. They hit that cap, that $19,000 limit, usually in June or July of each year, and it's frankly not enough. And like I said, we've had 7 dead bodies show up at these illegal grows here in Southern California just in the last few months. Would really appreciate hosting you out here and getting not only the DEA, but also ATF and FBI representatives to see firsthand what we're seeing on the ground here. And I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Garcia. At this time, the chair recognizes Mr. Trone of Maryland for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Mr. and Attorney General Garland. It's great to be here with you today. For the last decade or so, my office has been in Bethesda, so we're neighbors, and it's awesome to have someone of your qualifications in this job. I want to start off today about pretrial and jail incarceration rates. Even short stays, pretrial detention is associated with harmful outcomes, costing people their jobs, their homes, lose custody of their kids. This practice is also leads to an increased likelihood of being convicted, receiving a harsher sentence, and future involvement in the criminal justice system. The pretrial detention rates in the federal system are at a record level, 75% of individuals detained pre-trial. Disproportionately, this falls on people of color. Federal prosecutors have requested from 56% in 1997, now up to 77%, even though the data shows 99% of those released return to jail, to court. So, Mr. Garland, could you speak to DOJ's current pretrial retention policies and your views on pretrial detention?
Congressman, I quite agree with the concerns you express. I do think that unnecessary pretrial detention does make it harder for somebody to build a case to defend themselves, which is point one. And point two often means they lose their job, which even if they are then adjudicated as not guilty, damages their ability to make a livelihood. So there's no question about that. I served when I was the chief judge of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit on the executive committee of the Pretrial Services Agency for the District of Columbia. That's a statutory appointment. That agency has a nation-leading reputation for analyzing pretrial detainees and making recommendations to judges about which ones need to be detained, which ones don't, and what kind of more minimal conditions can be required. So, because they have a very good method of figuring out who might recidivate while on release or after release. And I know that the judges of both the federal court and the Superior Court are happy with the results of that. So one thing might be to help model that program in other districts. The federal law permits pretrial detention only if there's no combination of other kinds of conditions that will ensure the return of the person who's been arrested and secure the safety of the community. That's the underlying test. There are provisions that provide a presumption of detention when the sentence faced is extremely high, or when the crime itself is extremely dangerous. But even in those circumstances, it's only a presumption.
According to the Vera Center for Justice, after the enactment of the core crime bill, we spent $127 million a year on pretrial detention, today's dollars. Today, that's over $2 billion. Yet our prison population has been reduced significantly from where it was 3 decades ago. Does this seem like somewhat of an outsized increase to you, given these crime rates are lower?
I honestly don't know. I don't know the Vera statistics. I don't whether the reference is to federal pretrial detention or not. As you can imagine, we are not charging people with low-level crimes in order to prioritize our resources and, frankly, to be fair and just. We are looking for only in the area of street crime, violent offenders, big-time offenders. So it may be that our detention statistics are higher than you might guess. For example, if what we're looking at is what a local prosecutor brings in. But to be honest, I simply don't know the statistics that you're citing.
Thank you. That's the federal number. Quickly, the president's skinny budget outlined $1.5 billion, an increase over $500 million for grants to support the reform of state and local criminal justice systems, including federal funding to support diversions and alternative court programs.
Right.
Can you expand on how the funding could be used, allocated to safely reduce rates of pretrial detention?
Well, that's part of the important role that these alternative programs provide. The drug courts, the mental health courts often allow people released on personal recognizance, released altogether, pending various kinds of agreements to monitoring and substance abuse, to taking substance abuse programs, that sort of thing. And as you said, there's a $271 million in the OJP, Office of Justice Programs proposal, which can be given for those kinds of programs.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Trone. General Garland and members of our subcommittee, we will now take a 10-minute recess, and we will resume for our second round of questioning at 11:25 a.m. We're in recess. All right, let us gavel back in and resume our hearing with the Attorney General of the United States. Mr. Attorney General, I'm going to recognize myself for 5 more minutes of questions, and we'll begin our second round. I know you are acutely aware of the security needs of the federal judiciary. Last summer, we saw the shocking attack at the home of Judge Esther Salas in New Jersey, resulting in the death of her 20-year-old son and the wounding of her husband. A horrible incident by any measure. And in fact, it was found out later that the perpetrator was an anti-feminist extremist who had plans to conduct a similar attack on Associate Justice of the Supreme Court of the United States, Sonia Sotomayor. The Judicial Conference of the United States has noted significant concerns about the physical security of courthouses, that judges and courts are the targets of higher numbers of serious threat communications, and related measures indicate judiciary security is at greater risk. Do you agree that the federal judiciary faces a more dangerous security environment now than it has in times past?
I do, Mr. Chairman, and as you mentioned, I am acutely aware of this. I served when I was a judge on the Security Committee of the Judicial Conference of the United States, and I served as the chair of the Executive Committee of the Judicial Conference. And in both positions, I and the conference as a whole is extremely concerned about judicial security. I think with the rise of domestic violent extremism, judges, as is true of many other government officials, both in the federal and state governments, are becoming more likely to be targets. So this is something we have to be very, very concerned about.
Well, having said that, Attorney General, could you share how the Justice Department, particularly through the United States Marshal Service, can improve security, and whether there will be more judicial security resources in your fiscal year 2022 request?
Yes, thank you. You are right. It's the Marshal Service who are responsible for the protection of the federal judges. The fiscal year 21 budget included an additional $7.4 million for Marshals intelligence to use looking at open sources for threats and to expand their intelligence unit, and another $4.4 million to modernize the home intrusion security systems that Congress authorized a while ago for each federal judge. The specifics of the FY22 budget are not yet available, but they will include money for judicial security.
Well, thank you for that. We had a short discussion earlier about illegal drugs. Now, the Department of Justice devotes significant resources to reduce the impact of drugs on society. On the enforcement side, in fiscal year 2021, your overall DEA and federal organized crime and drug task force funding is just shy of $3 billion, with almost $400 million for grants under the Comprehensive Addiction and Recovery Act. Question is, how will the department ramp up efforts under your leadership to reduce the damage from prescription opioids and synthetic drugs?
Right, so this is a terrible scourge on our society, the consequences of prescription opioids, and we are spending currently $9.5 billion really across all of DOJ on all drug enforcement issues, which include diversion of opioids. DEA is working with FDA to limit the availability consistent with the needs of medical practice. But a significant part of this is not just law enforcement. A significant part is also in the president's budget, but not for DOJ, but for HHS, some $394 million in grants under the Comprehensive Addiction and Recovery Act as well. So there is a significant amount of money on both sides of this issue, protecting from a law enforcement point of view, and then helping addiction recovery.
Thank you. Well, Attorney General, in your view, what are the largest challenges still facing the department in its efforts to address the American opioid epidemic?
I'm glad you gave me an opportunity, because I think I mixed up the programs I was talking about. The president's budget with respect to the opioid problem for HHS is an increase in 3.9 billion. So I've got my decimal point in the wrong place, for which I apologize. It's a pretty big number. Those are the two kinds of areas in which we're trying to work here. One on the law enforcement side, and the other on the health side, and the relief for people who are addicted.
Thank you, sir. My time is up, and I'm going to yield to our ranking member, Mr. Adderholt, for 5 additional minutes of questions.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. Attorney General, last week we had a chance to have the some from the FBI before our subcommittee, and I had asked one of the questions that I asked was about if they had reclassified the 2017 congressional baseball shooting as a domestic terrorist attack rather than a case of suicide by cop. Unfortunately, I think the answer that I received was wholly unsatisfactory. As Attorney General, are you able to right this obvious wrong?
I did read about your question. I have not yet had a chance to speak with the FBI about it, but the department will speak with the FBI about this and find out what the situation was.
But from your understanding, obviously, it was well documented that the shooter was not aware that the Capitol Police would be there, and he clearly undertook defensive measures to shield himself from the bullets, but yet it was still classified as suicide by cop. So, just from what you understand about the case, would you be able to come in there and correct this wrong that has been, how it was classified?
I don't know enough about what the classification means at this point, or in what record it is, but I promise I will raise this issue with the FBI.
Well, I'd love to get some feedback on that, because this is clearly one of the cases where I think it needs to be reclassified, because I think the evidence is very clear. And actually, many members of Congress could have lost their lives in that situation. So it is a very important issue, I think, for all members of Congress, whether Democrat or Republican. One thing I want to, or another thing I'd like to ask about is about the private prisons. The Marshal Service maintains custody of approximately, and as I understand it, around 60,000 prisoners. And since the Marshal Service neither owns nor does it operate its own facility, it typically partners with the state and with local governments or the Bureau of Prisons, or enters into agreements with contract operated detention facilities in order to satisfy the humanely housed detainees. According to the Marshal Service, in several areas of the United States, the Bureau of Prison facilities and state and local facilities either do not exist or they have limited space for them to use. In those events, the Marshal Service houses inmates in contractor operated facilities. Nevertheless, in January, the president signed an executive order that arbitrarily eliminates the use of contractor operated detention facilities, including those used by the Marshal Service. Have you had a chance to evaluate the impact that this decision will have on the Marshal Service's budget and the administration of justice?
So the Marshal Service's contracting is with respect to pretrial detainees. And there are 13 private contracts that the Marshal Service currently manages. The Marshal Service began the process of ending 2 of those contracts that were set to expire within 90 days. The Marshal Service will be doing this evaluation in a way to ensure that it is able to safely house prisoners after transitions, and also make sure that their location near the community is still available. So this is not an immediate shut-off with respect to the Marshal Service. This will be done in a way that the Marshal Service is able to safely and efficiently manage the transition.
Could you talk about why it is important for the Department of Justice to house those in federal custody and to the maximum extent practicable in proximity to their communities and to their families or their lawyers?
Well, I quite agree. It is important for just exactly the reasons you point out. There is a need for lawyers to be able to speak with their clients, particularly obviously in this pretrial circumstance, so they can prepare their defense. And likewise, to be able to communicate with their families for purposes of ultimate reintegration into the community. Both of those are important factors, and that requires some question about what the vicinity means, but it definitely does mean relative ease of access. You're quite right about that.
One thing more I want to ask, how do you think the surge of illegal immigration impacts the Marshal Service's ability to secure adequate detention space?
I don't know the answer to that question, and I'll have to look into that and see if my staff can get back to you on that. I'm not sure the interrelationship between those two issues.
That would be helpful to get back to us on that. Thank you. I see my time's expired, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Adderholt. The chair recognizes Ms. Meng for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wanted to ask about the issue of ghost guns, which are one of the fastest growing gun safety issues in our country. President Biden, as you know, spoke about this a few weeks ago and announced a number of steps to combat it. They lack identifying marks, they leave no paper trail, and can be acquired without even a background check. It's no wonder they are favored by gun traffickers who are flooding our cities with illegal guns and armed extremists looking to undermine our democracy. Ghost guns can be made with unregulated kits, parts, or 3D printers using computer codes. Despite President Biden's actions to stop the proliferation of ghost guns, I was discouraged to see that a court overturned a stay stopping the release of computer code used to print 3D guns. Can you explain your thoughts on how the DOJ could tackle this issue, including what you know about the prevalence of these weapons and how the department could address kits, parts, and 3D printed firearms?
Yes, well, you've identified a serious problem with respect to these so-called ghost guns. They are kits that sometimes described as buy, build, shoot kits, where virtually all the components are contained in the kit, and with instructions for putting together into a gun within, sometimes within as little as 30 minutes. The problem is because they're not currently, it's not clear that they're defined as firearms themselves or as the frame or receiver of the firearm. They are not inscribed with a serial number, and there isn't a requirement for a background check before the purchase of the kit. This means somebody can get the gun who might be statutorily barred, say, for example, a former felon, from getting the kit and making the gun. And then once the gun is made, because it doesn't have a serial number, it's very difficult to trace. So the ATF has in the works right now, working up a proposal for rulemaking, which should be called a notice of proposed rulemaking, which should be coming out pretty soon. To address this question, there'll be a rulemaking period, and then depending on the result, a regulation with respect to ghost guns.
Okay, thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Meng. Mr. Palazzo, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Cartwright. this is somewhat of a technical question, Attorney General Garland. So if you don't have the exact answers, maybe you can submit them to me later. But the coronavirus pandemic has accelerated interest in the potential to use new technologies to facilitate the capture of fingerprints required to search federal and state criminal history record systems. Law enforcement organizations, as well as populations who are required to undergo FBI fingerprint-based background checks, desire to have new approved methods to capture and submit fingerprint images to the FBI using contactless technology. So, three-part question. Where is the FBI in its evaluation and approval of contactless technologies to acquire and submit fingerprint images to the FBI databases? What timeline is the FBI working from to enable new contactless acquisition methods? And please specify the timetable for FBI's evaluation and approval of these new technologies. We are aware that the Transportation Security Administration, as well as many state law enforcement agencies, have immediate need to use new contactless technologies and request that the FBI prioritize and expedite its evaluation of these new capabilities.
Well, Congressman, you did hit the nail right on the head. This is an area that I don't know the exact answer with respect to the contactless fingerprint technologies, but I can assure you that my team will get back to you on that. We'll find out what the answers to your question, including the timeline question, and get back to your staff as well.
Well, I would really appreciate that. And I know it's been mentioned several times during this hearing that lacking specifics to the president's budget request. I do know that when I was serving on a House Armed Services Committee, a popular question that we would ask the Joint Chiefs of Staff and others is, what keeps you up at night regarding the safety of the United States of America? Can you share with me maybe some of the things that you have grave concern about in protecting America and the Americans?
Right. So my oath is to protect the Constitution and Americans from all enemies, both foreign and domestic. And so both forms of terrorism are of extraordinary concern to me. We never want to take our eyes off of what happened on 9/11 and of the risks that the country continues to face from foreign origin terrorist attacks on the homeland. Likewise, we have a growing fear of domestic violent extremism and domestic terrorism. And both of those keep me up at night. Every morning, virtually every morning, I get a briefing from the FBI in both one or the other or both areas. Since the last time I was in the Justice Department, when both were concerns as well, the lethality of weapons available to these kind of terrorists, both foreign and domestic, has increased. The consequence of the internet and encryption means that they can send information and make plans much more swiftly and in greater secrecy than could have been done before. So we have an emerging and accelerating threat, and the department is putting its resources into defending the country with respect to both. And needless to say, this is an all-of-government problem and an all-of-government solution. Department of Homeland Security, extraordinarily important in these areas. And with respect to the foreign threats, obviously our intelligence services and the Department of Defense.
Attorney General, I appreciate you being with us today, and I thank the men and women under your jurisdiction and their families for their service and sacrifice. So with that, Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Palazzo. Mr. Case, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Attorney General. First of all, I do want to express support for some of the specific programs that are reflected in the president's budget from a policy perspective, and the ones that I would note from your testimony are support for the Office of Violence Against Women, especially to reduce the rape kit backlogs, community-oriented policing, enforcing our environmental laws and environmental justice, and finally enforcing our antitrust laws where we see too much centralization of power going on out there, market power. Definitely support those initiatives. Can I please return with you to the subject of immigration? Because in my prior questioning, I asked you whether your request for an increase in the immigration judges was enough, given the backlog of 1.3 million, I think it is, cases. And you said, yes, it is enough for the time. And I just want to kind of get into that a little bit more with you, because it seems pretty obvious to me that the delay in adjudication, especially on the asylum side, is directly manipulated by those that are engaged in human trafficking. And so therefore the answer to that seems to be in two categories. One would be the speed of adjudication, which addresses some of the issues there. And the other is perhaps a broader policy question of our asylum laws to start with. And so I guess the first question I would have is, why do you think your request is enough? And what actually will that achieve? Will it achieve a reduction in the backlog of adjudications to, 1 to 2 months? My understanding, at least, is that in some cases it's up to 2 years. I don't know that, but that's what I'm told, at least. And then finally, have you considered broader changes to our asylum laws, the procedure by which people can seek asylum, the standards for asylum? My understanding is that most of the asylum claims are denied when they're eventually adjudicated. So that would tell me that our asylum laws need to be updated. So two-part question, same problem.
Well, let me start with the human trafficking problem that you mentioned. This is part of our law enforcement concern and comes out of the law enforcement part of our budget. We do have a human trafficking task force, and we have some representatives in the Northern Triangle countries and in Mexico who are working on this problem. You're quite right that it is a significant problem that we have to defend against and provide law enforcement for. That the money for that is also already included within our criminal division budget. I can't tell you, exactly how much the reduction will be or to what number it will be with respect to the backlog. That's going to be the result of a combination of factors. So one being the increase in the number of immigration judges and their associated staff, and second being technology improvements that we're hoping will improve that, and a third would be the mechanisms that the Executive Office of Immigration Review is looking at to put into place to make these run more efficiently. So very difficult to project what the reduction will be, but with this kind of many-pronged attack on the problem, I think it should be quite substantial.
But if I could just interject there for a second, you made a request. I mean, the request is for 100 additional immigration judges. You have a 1.3 million backlog. There must have been some basic assumptions that you and your department made in requesting that level of increase in immigration judges and that level of increase in funding that somebody felt was going to result in a sufficient amount of resources committed to the problem. So there must have been an assumption of the problem and of where this got us to in the solution. And I guess what I'm asking is, what are those assumptions? Are you assuming that there will be then a significant reduction, a very significant reduction in the backlog, which would I think at least result in some relieving of pressure on the exploitation of the weakness?
I agree with you that reducing the backlog will reduce the exploitation of the weakness. There's a total of a 21.5% increase here, which it's focused precisely on the backlog. We are also trying to hire up for positions that were not filled. So it's not just 100 additional. And there are limits to our ability to hire in any particular year. So we're trying to be good stewards of the money that you provide us. This is the amount of money that we believe we can effectuate. We can hire up for authorized level that are not yet hired. and then with the new hires and to make a significant impact.
Okay, well, we'll leave it there, and I appreciate the response.
Thank you, Mr. Case. Mr. Klein, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to stay with the issue of Second Amendment rights. Attorney General, recently the Supreme Court agreed to hear a challenge to a New York law that effectively prevents law-abiding members of the public, including those with advanced firearms training, from carrying a handgun in public for self-defense. Now, as you know, in the past, the department has sided with the individual rights view of the Second Amendment and the individual's right to keep and bear arms. Can you state today that the DOJ will support that constitutional right to bear arms for self-defense and support the challenge to this law in court?
Well, there's no question that there's an individual right to bear arms for self-defense. Supreme Court has so held now at least twice. So there's no doubt about that question. The issue in this case is an effort I think on both sides to clarify exactly what the scope of that right is. And that's what the Supreme Court will do in that case. When it does, then we'll know. Right now, there is some uncertainty as to the extent of the right, whether it extends to open carry, whether it extends to concealed carry, whether it extends outside the home. Those are at least part of that issue will be clarified by the Supreme Court. But the question of an individual right is not up for grabs. The Supreme Court's already decided that question.
Attorney General, your FY22 request includes $100 million, which would go to programs creating government incentives for states to adopt gun licensing laws and buyback programs. Are you creating a gun confiscation program?
The answer to that is no. My understanding of the buyback programs is that they are exactly that when, and I'm not completely familiar with all the details, but my understanding is that these are circumstances where somebody has been adjudicated impermissible to have a gun anymore. For example, because he's committed a felony or any of the other statutory violations in a particular state. There has to be a method of taking the gun away without expropriating it. And I think that's the purpose of these statutes, to remove guns from people who are entitled to by providing.
So it's your contention that this is not a program that will use taxpayer dollars to take lawfully owned firearms away from Americans?
No, it's at the bottom. It's a totally voluntary program with respect to the purchase. With respect to people who are not permitted to have the gun, that's up to each state as to how to deal with this. So these are, to be clear, these are about state laws, not about federal laws.
I was a prosecutor for several years. I worked in a jurisdiction that was engaged in a 287G agreement with the locality to honor ICE detainers. And when law enforcement agencies don't honor ICE detainers, these individuals who often have significant criminal histories, are engaged in sex trafficking, drug trafficking, are released onto the street and present a potential and real public safety threat. As our nation's top law enforcement official and someone with a statutory responsibility for fostering a cooperative and complementary relationship with state and local law enforcement, not to mention DOJ's federal partners, do you believe that state and local law enforcement and entities should honor ICE detainers?
Well, I believe that if ICE has lawfully levied a detainer, then yes, they should.
Staying with this issue related to local prosecutions, I was a domestic violence prosecutor for many years, and your budget claims to expand funding for restorative justice programs using a portion of the funding allocated for Violence Against Women Act programs. Domestic violence perpetrators are often manipulators of their victims, and once a victim musters the courage to report or leave their abuser, an abuser will often do or say just about anything to convince the victim to return to the relationship, hence the vicious and often deadly cycle of abusive relationships. Doesn't restorative justice by definition involve victims and perpetrators re-engaging with each other?
These are state and local programs where the people on the ground have the best idea of which circumstances they work in and which ones they don't work in. The problem that you're pointing out is indeed a problem, and where there's a risk of manipulation, the program shouldn't be used. I don't disagree with that, but those are to be determined by what works on an evidence-based set of facts.
Are you aware of any studies that involve restorative justice in domestic violence or sexual violence cases?
I don't know. No, I'm not.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Klein. Mr. Garcia, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Attorney General, thank you again for your patience. I just want to revisit the first discussion that we had about illegal marijuana operations, particularly in Southern California, just to close that out. I do want to clarify in alignment with your statements that these are definitely not legal operations. These aren't businesses that are being sanctioned underneath California's cannabis industry regulations, nor are they taxed. There's no oversight. There's no regulatory body touching them. And these are also not, I would say, mom and pop operations or single families with small illegal grows in their backyards. These are in Southern California, very large scale nurseries being put up in the middle of our desert. They are literally stealing water out of fire hydrants and out of California's aqueduct system. They are in some cases stealing land and squatting on these desert properties. And in many cases, over 90% of them using free labor in the form of indentured servants from people who are here illegally and don't have an ability to go to police like most employees would have. So this is truly a threat. It's a national security threat. It's an international threat. It's a domestic threat. And I would really welcome you to send a delegation out here to see it firsthand. This isn't a political thing by any stretch of the imagination, but I would love to have your commitment to have a small delegation from DEA, ATF, and if appropriate, FBI to come see it firsthand. We're starting to get traction with local law enforcement, but they desperately need the funding and support from the federal level. Would you be able to make a commitment to support at least a visit here to Southern California on this?
Well, let me have a chance to speak to the DEA about this, or to have one of my staff speak to the DEA and see what they know about the circumstances that you're describing. They certainly, the way you're describing them, of course, plus you mentioned, I think, 7 dead bodies being found, a combination of large-scale illegal activity, violence, indentured servitude. None of those are things that we should be ignoring. So I will be sure that the DEA looks into this.
Thank you, Attorney General. I truly do appreciate that. This is something I think all hands on deck, all levels of government is necessary to actually eradicate this. And like I said, it's actually bad for the legal cannabis industry as well. That's a sort of collateral negative effect. I do want to also go back to the conversation that we had around voter ID. I want to just tag up on my friend Representative Klein's comments and your response real quick to that. You mentioned that voter ID, the question with voter ID comes down to, does voter ID cause a disparate effect on certain demographics? I'd like to just get your sense of the answer to that in your opinion. And I know you're not an election expert. I know you're not necessarily a social justice expert as well, but in your opinion, do you think requiring identification for the purposes of participating in an election does cause disparate effects on certain demographics? And if so, which demographics are those? Why does it cause a disparate effect, and what can we do to help that?
Yeah, so I should have added intentional or disparate impact, obviously. And the answer to that is in general is it depends on the particular jurisdiction and circumstances. Not, Supreme Court's made clear, and as I pointed out, the mere fact of requiring voter ID alone is not the issue. The question is whether it deprives individuals of the right to vote, and sort of what the risk on the other side, what the evidentiary risk on the other side of fraud is. So you can certainly imagine. You don't need to imagine. I think as a general at a sort of a high level, the question is: are there people in demographic groups, for example, African Americans, who do not have voter ID? For any number of reasons. They may not have, there may be people in poor and disadvantaged neighborhoods who don't have automobiles and therefore don't have driver's license, who are unemployed and therefore don't have those kind of identifications. So the question of having a photo ID is, and to many of us is, not a problem. Everybody we know has a voter ID, but that is not the case for many people all across America. And when it comes out that deprives people of their right to vote, we have a serious problem. And that is something that's determined on a case-by-case basis. And it is, as the chairman mentioned, it is a resource-intensive investigation to make a determination of whether in a particular circumstances voter ID has that consequence.
Thank you, Attorney General. If I may, Mr. Chairman, I do know a lot of Black people, Hispanics, poors of all demographic, and they certainly haven't had a challenge getting identifications. I think it's offensive to those demographics to imply that. But I yield back, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Attorney General.
Thank you, Mr. Garcia. Well, Attorney General Garland, you have held up well under the withering fusillade of interrogation of this subcommittee. I thank you for joining us. And I look forward to further discussion of the full budget from the White House when we get it. In the meantime, I want to compliment you on the bipartisan nature of the portraiture behind you. It looks like we have President Gerald Ford's Attorney General, and obviously President Kennedy's and Johnson's Attorney General. A lot of people might not be familiar with Edward Hirsch Levi. Have I pronounced his name correctly? Okay. He was said to be the top lawyer of his generation. I'm glad you have his portrait on the wall, not only because he was a Republican Attorney General, but because he was such a preeminent trial lawyer at his time.
I'm no art expert, but I do revere both of those attorneys general.
I also wanted to ask you, by the way, there was a prior predecessor of yours named Garland. It was Attorney General Augustus Garland, who was Grover Cleveland's Attorney General. I take it you're his great-grandson.
No, and my understanding, he's in a famous Supreme Court case involving a pardon of a Confederate sympathizer. So I think I'd like to keep distance from him.
You're disowning him, all right. Well, Attorney General Garland, thank you for favoring us with your presence today. We'll have you back, and we'll have more questions about the direction of the Department of Justice and the funding that it requires over time. Members of the subcommittee and Attorney General Merrick Garland, this hearing is hereby adjourned.